Hey guys, Scarlett here. I hope you all are doing well today. So for my returning subscribers, welcome back. And for anyone new here, welcome. I post weekly videos about tarot, paganism, and magic. So if those are topics that interest you, do please hit that subscribe button below. And today we have a tarot episode for you. And this is all going to be about where is tarot from? Because there are a lot of misconceptions out there when it comes to the origins of tarot. I've heard a lot of statements from people who claim that tarot comes from ancient Egypt or that these symbols originate from Atlantis. So there's a lot of misinformation out there. So I thought I would tell you guys a bit about the origins of tarot so that you can be a bit more understanding of the historical journey that this divination practice has evolved from. So let's begin with the origins of tarot. So contrary to popular belief, tarot doesn't go as far back as the ancient civilizations. It actually originates in northern Italy, most likely during the late 14th or 15th century. And we know what the oldest surviving deck is, and that is the Visconti Sforza. I actually have a copy here. So this is the Visconti Sforza deck. And this deck was created for the Duke of Milan and his family at around 1440. So that's the time period you're looking at, and the location being northern Italy. Even today, if you go to Milan, you'll actually see quite a few tarot shops out and about. So in Italy, and especially northern Italy, they are pretty proud of their tradition with tarot. Of course, with tarot, it didn't become a divination method until much later. It was originally created to be like playing cards for a game that was similar to bridge, if you're familiar with that card game. And this card game was called Tarocchi. So it was a popular card game among like the nobles and the wealthy in northern Italy at that time. So for the most part, this deck probably would have been used for playing this card game and wouldn't have had all of the direct associations with the metaphysical, with the subconscious, with the archetypes that we attribute tarot to now. I would have one addendum on that. I do find it interesting that each of these images, and this is a facsimile deck, so it's a good quality reproduction of these images. They have a little hole at the top for each one, suggesting that not only were they played with as like a playing card deck, they were also like hung on a wall with like a nail kind of punched through. So that does beg the question, were they almost like religious icons too? So you can go in a bit of a metaphysical direction with this deck if you want, but for the most part, the general understanding is that tarot started as a playing card game called Tarocchi. And this is most likely one of the first decks. There could have been decks that have been made before this one was created in 1440, though we don't know for sure. Another thing about the specific images of the major arcana here, so there are different theories. According to one tarot historian, Gertrude Moeckley, I might be pronouncing that name wrong, but the belief that the cards and their imagery actually derive from the costume figures who participated in the carnival parades, which actually are around, carnival actually started at around like I think 1100 AD, so it's much older than I originally thought. So carnival from Italy has been around for a while, and the one theory is that the images are actually from the costume figures that you see at a carnival parade. So that's what I view as the origin of tarot. Now, it does have an interesting evolution through time. So the game Tarocchi did spread across other European countries, including especially southern France. And this is where you get the Marseille deck starting to be created. And at this point, you had Tarocchi being switched in name to tarot, which is a French word. So this is why we call it tarot, and you don't pronounce that T because it's French. Though if you are Italian, you could still call it Tarocchi because that is originally what this was referred as. So even though you have the creation of the Marseille deck, the cards weren't really considered mystical until around the late 18th century. And that's at a time when occultism in general started to become in vogue or trendy. And that's when you start to have that connection between these images and these archetypes, these symbols, representing something a bit more than costumed carnival figures. And also a man named Antoine Courtegablin, I might be pronouncing that wrong, but he wrote a really popular book at the time which linked the cards to ancient Egyptian lore. And in that book, he actually argued that these symbols in tarot actually contained secret wisdom from the Egyptian god Thoth. So this is where you get that Egyptian connection with tarot. So this is one particular theory that someone wrote from France connecting these symbols to the Egyptian god Thoth. And you might be ringing a bell with that name, Thoth, right? Sometimes it's called Thoth, sometimes it's called Tot. So this is the ibis-headed Egyptian god. He was the god of scribes, but also the god of magic. And there is a deck that was created much later on called the Thoth deck. And this has a lot to do with Aleister Crowley, who in part created this deck. But that happened much later. So that's where you get that connection to Egypt, which, you know, maybe there is something to the fact that these symbols are older than 1400s Italy, but the cards themselves and the concepts of putting them together in a cohesive deck, that doesn't really originate from ancient Egypt. So you also have another French writer, Eliphas Levi, who popularized this particular notion that the symbols in tarot were connected to the Hebrew alphabet and thus to the Jewish system of Kabbalah. And yes, if you learn tarot today, the cards do have different Hebrew letters that are associated with them, and a lot of Kabbalah mysticism incorporated within tarot. So there is a connection there between Kabbalah and tarot, though that was something that was added on a bit later. So another thing that people who are unfamiliar with tarot connect with tarot is gypsies, right? You have that classic image of a gypsy caravan, and then you'd have the gypsy tarot reader reading your future, right? So that is a conception that comes about from the 19th century. So there was a popular book that was written, it's kind of like a pulp book, and it was called The Tarot of the Bohemians, and that's what connected tarot with gypsies. And the book calls it a gypsy invention, and in part that comes from a belief at the time that gypsies were originated from Egypt, but we know in reality that's not true. So that's where you get this weird kind of gypsy tarot tie-in. But beyond that book and that kind of fad at the time of connecting gypsies with the knowledge, the secret wisdom of ancient Egypt, it doesn't really have any basis in reality. So that's where you get that kind of misconception going on. So later on, you did have mystical groups such as the Theosophical Society, as well as the Rosicrucians, and they turned tarot into an American fad in the early 1900s. So this is when tarot really travels to America and starts to become popular here. So if you are new to tarot, if you are a tarot lover like myself, you're of course probably familiar with the Rider-Waite deck. And some people call this deck the Rider-Waite deck, and it was created in 1909 by A.E. White, who was a British member of an organization called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. However, some people also call this the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, giving credit to the artist of these images, Pamela Colman Smith. So it's up to you what you call it. I tend to just call it the Rider-Waite deck. But this deck has now become the most popular deck in America. Now, it would be different if you go to France, and in France, the Marseille deck is still most likely the more popular deck that you see tarot practitioners using. But here in America, and also in other countries as well, this has become the go-to deck. This is the deck that really officially connects tarot to divination, as well as the symbols within tarot are being connected to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, as well as certain beliefs from the Theosophical Society, as well as certain aspects from the Kabbalah. So this is where you have the connection between all of that historical imagery. Yes, you still have similar characters like the Fool all the way back to the Visconti Sforza, but they've really added on layers and layers and layers by this point of metaphysical and esoteric meaning. So when you look at a deck like this, you are not only going back to 1400s Italy to some of these early symbols, these early characters, and these early archetypes, you're also layering in symbols, meaning, ideas, philosophy from centuries of esoteric thought and wisdom. So that's why this deck people turn to. Though there are plenty of contemporary decks out there that are wonderful. Some do follow the line from the Visconti Sforza all the way through the Marseille, through the Rider-Waite deck, and keep a lot of that symbology, a lot of these common ideas, and some really deviate from that historical line. So there is quite a lot of variety nowadays when it comes to contemporary decks. But I just wanted to show you, and in this brief video, try to get, this idea of the historical understanding of tarot, bring that to you in a few short minutes so you could have a better conception of where tarot is from. And of course, there is a lot more to this story. There is a lot more nuance. So maybe I'll go into more detail on that in a future video. Let me know your thoughts on my video, my thoughts, my ideas. If you are a tarot historian, do please let me know if I left anything super important out or if I have any corrections that I need to make. But thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you all next week. Bye.